to part 8 of A Little Birdie Told Me. We're going to be working some embroidery here up in this section. Ignore this. You shouldn't have that already. I have another section I will show you how to do that in. But we're going to start down here. We're just going to run a little running stitch right up from the tip of this oya under the tulip and back around. I did one already. I'll show you. So we're going to work with the beads and the lighter color of the tulip, which is F. 2 strands of that. Grab that on a needle and your beads that you used for this section in here. So grab that and we will get started. Okay, so I might have said we're going to do a running stitch, but we're actually going to do a back stitch. I didn't really draw the lines out. I just sort of visualize it. You can tell I already stitched it and then took it out, but it's really a simple line to visualize. You're just going to come down at an angle, go underneath, and then come back up at an angle. And every other back stitch, we're going to take a bead. So just back stitches, you're just putting the needle about 1/8 of an inch away and come up about 1/8 of an inch apart from that. Pull the stitch through. This time before you take a stitch, you're just going to pick up a bead with your needle and do a back stitch. So what that means is you're just going to go right back into the hole where you were coming out of and come out where you want your next stitch. Just want to make sure that's centered. And then that pops that little bead up like that. It's really pretty. This one we're not going to do a bead, so we're going to do every other. Kind of makes this nice little lacy effect. And then back stitch and come up. And then just watch, watch the distance between here and here when you come back to do the other side. And just sort of make sure that it's flowing, it's arcing down. Again, don't have to be really careful. You can draw lines in wool is just impossible to mark. A little hair marker may do the trick. If your wool's really dark, you can use chalk. Okay, that's a no bead. And then here's a bead, back stitch. And we're going to start to angle it down a little bit. And if you do a stitch that angles too far, or it's kind of funky, it doesn't flow really nicely, it's no big deal to just take it out. Orient the stitches the way you want them to go. Even though that sounds time consuming, it's less time consuming than marking it, if you ask me. And then you can just kind of get a natural curve. Okay, so every other stitch, just pick up a bead and that's all that is. So you're going to go all the way down here, come all the way back up, and then we're going to put little X's on there. Okay, so we're going to work a little layer on top of this. Some of the best embroidery stitches that I've seen are worked in layers, several layers worked on top of each other. So it's kind of fun to combine different skills. So we're going to make 7 X's here and 7 X's coming from here. So the first thing you want to do is about 1/8 of an inch away from the top of that first stitch, come up. This is with a single strand of the embroidery floss that matches the dots. I believe that's C. So we're going to work X's, but we're going to do the one slant and then come back and do the other slant. And how you work that is you're going to insert the needle, so the next stitch, the one with the bead, at the bottom of the bead you're going to insert the needle and work perpendicular. So you're just going to go under the bead and come straight back up. Always trying to remember to leave 1/8 of an inch, go down 1/8 of an inch. And what will happen is that the first slant of the X will form. If you can see that. So now it's just a matter of working perpendicular to each stitch. So you see how I'm just under 1/8 of an inch, under the stitch, 1/8 of an inch. Every time you do that, because you're coming from the stitch behind it, it's going to make a little X. So now we're at the bead. Working perpendicular, you're just going straight under so that bead sits right on top of that needle. And what you'll have is then two, you'll have that one slant on this side of the bead, but then you'll have two in between each bead. So that's 3 lines. Another bead. 5. And I just, of course, stopped at 7 because I didn't want to get so crowded down into here. It's just a nice little accent on that, on the ends of it. All right, so there's 7 lines. And then it's the same exact thing, and then this time you have guidelines. So you're coming from here, you're going to go over into the stitch and straight up, exiting out the top of that X, first part of the X, first part of the slant. So still we're working perpendicular. You see, you're just going to go, now it's under the bead, and come up just where that X is. Oops. And then cross your X's. And then when you slowly pull through, just make sure that the yarn is on, or the thread is on the correct side of the bead. Through. And then finish it out. And then just tie a knot in the back. Do that all the way around for all 4 sections. Okay, and this is what we're going to be doing next. So with 2 strands of yarn H, which is a DMC floss, we're going to just be putting little lazy daisies in the where the V of the X is. So what that looks like, just put your needle right into the V, the divot at the top of the X. Put your needle right back in. Remember, the yarn has to be under that stitch. In order to make that lazy daisy. So right next to it, in that V. I usually just lay the thread down and hold it with my thumb, just to keep it in place. Not very tall here, just kind of match. Make sure you've got a nice arc. Yarn goes under, and then pull. Alright, so work that in the 7 X's on each side. Okay, now you just have a sweet little gathering of color on either side of that tulip. Of course, if you want to do more embroidery, please do. You know, you can add a bigger bead here, some French knots, some more leaves. You know, I'm just showing you what I've done on my pillow, but don't stop there if you feel like your piece needs more. Obviously, keep going. More is more on this thing. You can't do too much. The next thing we're going to do is take thread E, which is that size 8 pearl cotton, and we're going to run a back stitch line from here. So we're going to mimic, you know, it's going to mimic this line, stop here, all the way around the circle, and back up. I've done one here, and I'll show you what that looks like. This has the layers of embroidery on it, but you can see the line that we're going to follow. So when you stitch here, we're going to stay about 1/2 inch away from the circle because we're kind of cramped in there. We're going to do 1/4 inch back to 1/2 inch. So we'll start that one. And we're coming right up from the tip of the teardrop. So usually what I do here is I'll just make sure that my needle is parallel to this line, 1/2 inch away. And it's hard to tell unless you're in it. You pull the thread back and you can kind of see, maybe I'm angled in a little bit, so, and we're just taking 1/4 inch, not 1/4 inch, we're just taking 1/8 inch stitches here, length stitches. going back into the hole from the first stitch, passing that where the thread is coming out. Make sure your needle's lying parallel to this. And backstitch a line as smooth as you can. Parallel to that edge. And we're going to stop right there. I'll show you what I mean. So when you get close to the circle, you can change direction. So you're going to come back out that stitch. Rather than extend it, you're just going to come right out at the end of it and then run your needle parallel to the dot. And run a back stitch along that guy until you get back up to the other side. And again, rather than going beyond it, because we want to stay about that 1/2 inch, just go into the stitch and come right out of where the thread is coming out of, and that way you can just switch directions. And our goal is to just make that horizontal, that parallel line that follows this about 1/2 inch away, about ending here. And we're going to be putting embroidery on top of that. So if you have those little blips like I've got there, it's not a big deal. And of course you can measure this if you want to. You know, you can mark it, chalk it, whatever you have to do to make you comfortable with that line. I'm a little devil may care, you know. I know there's a bunch of stuff going on there and I'll never see any sort of blip like that, so I just gotta go for it. But and it's knotting it on the back. And we're going to run those little X's again, but this time we'll do it a little bit differently. Okay, so this is with 2 strands of embroidery floss J, I believe. Yes, which is the black. And we're going to be doing the same thing, except for this time we're going to be skipping every other stitch. So the X's will be bigger, and you'll get this extra little cross hatching right there, which I really like. And so the other difference is you're going to come up right in between those stitches, every other one. So I'm just kind of trying to come up at the very first one. This is that first stitch. Rather than there, what you're going to do is go here. So you're perpendicular to not where the first stitch ended, but where the second one is, and come right out in between those two. So you're going to have an extra long slant. There's only going to be like 5 or 6 crosses here. So again, my stitch is ending here, my second stitch is here. So at the same height as this and perpendicular to that stitch, I insert the needle and come right out that second stitch, not that first one, remember. Okay, not here, but here. You can almost lay your needle down, draw it up, and that's where you're going to insert it. Might be a little high. We'll go a little bit lower. And come up between those stitches. Perpendicular to your line, right here. And then when you get to the end, the little corner, we're going to not try to crowd this, but we do need a stitch in there. So what we're going to do is not here, here, it's right in the middle, and then just come up. Now I find it easier, rather than to keep going, is I'm going to cross those X's now and then start the little section, because this is starting at an angle and it's a smaller X. Okay, so this was a first. The video wasn't taping when I came back to show you what to do on the X's. So here's a little sample. Forgive the disruption of flow, but when you come back to do the X's, what you're looking for is you're gonna come into a place that's just on alongside of where the top of the other part of the X is, and what you're looking for is the space in between those stitches, the one that didn't get hit, the one we skipped on the way going forward. So from here, again, you're just on the other side of the top of the X, working still perpendicular to your line. Come into this space that you skipped, right on that line. And that way you've got little X's above and little X's below it. Okay, so again, still working perpendicular. It's a little bigger. Right in here. And then all the way back. And when you're done, of course you can knot it in the back. Honestly, you can just put that down, knot it, and start again, but this space is not that far. So what I would do is I would just come back up. I know in the sample we ended up in the middle. It doesn't really matter. Just kind of make it so that this is not crowded, but not blank either, you know. So come out of the center, skip that stitch, work perpendicular. You're almost putting, you could really even put in the needle into where the top of that X is, right? And then run the whole first part of the X line all the way to the other side of the dot, which would be about here. And these are going to be so much smaller, remember. I know I don't have the dot on here, but you're still coming over, skipping that stitch, and the tulip is sitting right here, so you're really little. And then, of course, coming back, same thing, just on the other side of the X, working perpendicular, and find that place that you skipped. So hopefully that's helpful. I'm so sorry about that. I don't really know what happened there, but anyway, I think this will give you a good idea of what to do. So you've got a little X right there in the middle, and then just continue the trellis up to the other side. And then this is what it'll look like. So after the X's are done, you'll notice there's a little, every other stitch doesn't have an X crossing it, and that's what we're going to work on next. So what I've got here is the strand of size 5 pearl cotton multicolor, which is thread I. And just above, maybe 1/4 of an inch, above that first free stitch, take your needle out. And then what you're going to do is you're going to kind of slide it under the stitch before it, through the middle of the X here underneath it. Try not to catch too much of the background, otherwise you might get yourself away from that X more than you want to. And then up through the stitch on the other side of it. Pop that right back down into there and then make a tiny little stitch. So you're going into the same hole you came out of and just making a loop. And of course you can add a bead right there. You know, anything that I'm doing you can elaborate on, change, of course. You don't have to do exactly what I'm doing. Just some ideas for you. Here's our next stitch right here. So when you go down into the next X in the previous stitch, you're going to be sharing that and try to work under all the threads. Okay, you'll be sharing that with the next one. In through here, up through the stitch on the other side, insert your needle right back down into where you're coming out of, one little tiny stitch, and then just pop that down and nail that guy in there. Alright, I'll do one more for you. Next stitch. Sharing it. Under the X. Up through the next stitch over. little tiny stitch and lock it in place. Okay, so you're going to do that on top of all these X's. Obviously we're going really tiny here, really tiny. So this little stitch right here, I went pretty close to the top. That little stitch is just a little blip, just to lock it in. And then work to here. So do that on all 4 corners, and then we'll start to work on this sparkly thread. So for the next section, we're going to be using that sparkly yarn that I included in the kits. It's basically just you can use sparkly embroidery floss. It's about the same width, maybe a little heavier than the DMC floss that you can get at Joann's or the big box stores that's sparkly. If you want sparkle, of course you don't have to use sparkle. And we're going to fill in these pieces of reverse applique and then make this little squiggly. Turn this guy around here. Okay, and I've got a knot in the end, of course, of my yarn. Basically just coming up at the top of the teardrop shape, loosely back down into the corner. Just at that very tip of the opening, and here. Through here, down. You see I'm just carrying it across. I'm not knotting it or anything in between. Here. And then down. And then you can just let that rest in there for a little bit. What we're going to do now is called couching. And typically what that means is just stitching over a yarn that's been placed or a thread that's been placed on your background, just to keep it in place and shape it and get it into that curve that you want it to get into. And typically you do this with a smaller yarn, that way you can use larger yarns and not have to pierce your fabric. So it's just a matter of going over the yarn, centering it in this little space, and every 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch or so, just space them evenly, it doesn't really matter. And then I like to just actually pierce the yarn just to hold it in place so it doesn't shift around. And just do that within each section. And you don't have to tie it off or knot it in the back, just continue on. Couching that yarn down and just putting this where you want it to. This is still loose, so you can adjust over here where you need to. Okay, so I've couched all the way across. And again, at the very last one, I like to just sort of sink the needle into the yarn just to get it in place. Flip it over. Make a little knot. And then with the yarn that you couched, the sparkly yarn, just make a little knot here. Now that we know that we've got all the slack out and the yarn is just where we want it to be. Then we're going to run that little squiggly line up here. It's kind of a fun little stem. Next week we'll be adding the bouquets, and we'll be doing a little bit of stump work. So this is just sort of a basic layered embroidery lesson. Real quick. I'm coming up sort of between the dot on one side of the center applique there. And I know I'm going to be squiggling it, but I'm not going to try to force that right now. I know that I'm going to exit out of sort of a space between, you know, the widest part of the curve and here, because we're going to put just some little embroidery details on either side of the tulip. So we don't want the stem too long, you know, just maybe right there. And just like as you did before, just let it sit there while you work with the couching. And it's the same thread E, the size 8 pearl cotton, and we're just going to run a real quick little zigzag. So away from the tip, maybe 1/4 of an inch away from the tip. Go ahead and put in your first couching thread. And I'm going to go around it for the first time. Make sure it's just where I want it. And then stab that yarn to make sure that it stays in place. Then we're going to come down here and again, just make 2 little teeny tiny stitches, and then when you put that second one down underneath, just stab that yarn so it doesn't move. Next one, about a 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch away. And you can always shape it, kind of play with it a little bit. We'll do that when we put the French knots in. Stab the yarn. About 1/2 inch down here on the bottom. Stab that yarn. And this is great because this is out of the way, but yet we can pull it, because all we've done is just popped it through the exit point. Right up to where like the biggest part of that base is. Okay, and then the last one is not quite at the tip, but maybe 1/4 of an inch away. Pull this taut how you want it, and then we'll run another couching thread right over the end of it, just to lock it in. And then of course just repeat that on the other side, being mindful of where you started. You know, here you want to make sure you go up, you want to mirror it. So there's 1, 2, 3 points here, and 1, 2, 3 points here. Okay? And then grab your yarn, your thread eye again, the multicolor, and we're just going to run a bunch of French knots and just sort of fill in that space. Okay, so the French knots, I mean, you can do anything you want to. What I did is I just kind of put 3 in each corner. So it's sort of a little cascade of knots. You can totally do a different color. You could just do 1 in each one, you know, whatever you want to do. I really like this color, so I wanted to bring more of that in. And that's what I decided to do. So let me work a quick French knot for you. Do one at the base. So I'm just coming up, and I think we've done this already before, but I'll just really quick do another. 1, 2, 3, and then remember the yarn slides underneath. Insert the needle back almost into that same spot, holding the yarn, and slowly pull it. You'll have a perfect little knot. Of course, you can do more here. It would be really pretty to add beads in these X's. You can weave yarn or other threads in here to sort of even tone down if yours is really bright like mine and you want something different in there. You know, you can pop another little stitch inside here, a bead, whatever you want to do. Kind of let your mind run with it, because as you're working, you'll come up with some ideas. And go ahead and try them, and if you don't like it, you can always take it out. So play with it, have fun. This was a quick little down and dirty, sort of basic layered embroidery lesson. Next week, we're going to be doing the free-form bouquets on either side of the tulip, and we'll work the stump work, so just a beginning stump work bud. And then finish off the pillow. So next week will be our very last lesson. I can't wait to see what you guys are coming up with, and keep sending those pictures in. I'd love to share them with everybody who's watching. Thanks so much. Take care.